questions, type them into your phone or something if you're going to forget, and I'm happy to answer them at the end. So let me introduce myself. I'm Haviva Davids Diena, and I'm a speech-language pathologist. I want to thank Jane for inviting me to speak last week, and apparently there was such pent-up demand to come all the way north to Thornhill that she asked me to come again tonight. I want to, just by a show of hands, try and figure out ages of your kids. Anyone here have a 5-year-old? Okay, 4-year-old? 3-year-old? Okay. 2-year-old? 1-year-old? And infant?
1 month old.
1 month old. Okay, great. So we've pretty much got all the ages covered. So it sounds like we have quite a few older kids, like older meaning preschool, like 3, 4, and 5. So I'm going to focus on that today. If you have any questions about the younger set, about the little ones, the 1s and 2s, I'm happy to answer those questions as well afterwards. But today I'm going to focus more on the preschool kids. What I'm going to do is I'm going to discuss the milestones for ages 3, 4, and 5. I'm going to let you know when you should worry. And I'm going to let you know if you need to worry, what you should do. And then I'm just going to give you some ideas of things that you can do at home to help improve your child's communication skills. Before I begin, I just want to explain a few terms. So when people talk about a speech-language pathologist, sometimes people say, I never heard of a speech-language pathologist. A speech-language pathologist is actually the Canadian name for a speech therapist. But because speech-language pathologist is so long, and you need to be a speech-language pathologist to pronounce that correctly, we just tend to get called speech therapists, or for short, we get called SLPs, which is really just the really short ones. What we do as a speech-language pathologist is we work with people from birth all the way up through geriatrics, depending on which area of the field you work in. I work mostly with pediatrics up through young adults. And I work in 3 different areas. I work on speech, on language, and on feeding. I'm not going to discuss feeding tonight, simply because that's another whole amazing topic. I'm going to discuss speech and language. And speech refers to how we actually use our spoken word, how we use our speech to communicate. And speech includes things like articulation, which is pronunciation, so how we say our sounds, how we say our words. It includes voice, and voice includes how high or low your volume is, if you're hoarse. When I was 12, someone came up to my parents and said, you know, you need to get your daughter checked out. She has an awfully low voice for a 12-year-old girl. They did take me to get checked out, and I just have a very low voice, except I'm not 12 anymore. So that's part of it. And the last part of speech is fluency or stuttering. And again, when we speak, even if we have good pronunciation and even if we have no problems with our voice, we don't speak too loudly, we don't speak too quietly, sometimes we have problems with the fluency, that is, things come out bumpy or stuttered, and that's another area of speech. When we talk about language, what we mean by that is just overall communication. So when I take in information or I give out information, that's a process of language. So understanding and speaking. But speaking isn't only speech, which we talked about in the speech part. Speaking is also any kind of communication where we give information. It could be written, so we read something, we text somebody. It could be sign language, could be gestures. So all of that is included when we talk about language. So what I want to discuss tonight is basically what are the milestones, what's normal for kids at those preschool ages. And I want you to keep in mind that kids develop gradually. Nobody has a newborn that mysteriously comes out of the womb talking and starts orating at age 1. That doesn't happen. What we tend to see is a very gradual progression of speech and language skills. And we expect them to hit certain milestones as they reach certain ages. But that doesn't mean that that's an absolute. It's not that, my goodness, on my child's first birthday, he needs to be able to say 5 words or else something is really wrong. So I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but just bear in mind, it doesn't mean anything is seriously wrong with your child if they're not meeting every single milestone. For my job, I love being a speech language pathologist. I love waking up in the morning. I love knowing that today I can improve someone's communication skills. That somebody could be a 1-year-old who's not talking yet. It could be a 22-year-old who needs to tweak how they pronounce things so people could understand them more clearly, anyone in between. Really my goal when I work with anybody is successful communication, and that really takes place either in the speech or the language arena. I also love my job of being a mom. I'm a mom of 5 kids. They range from 6 to 19, and there's 2 girls in there and 3 boys. What's great about being both a mom and a speech pathologist is I found that doing both jobs really makes me much better at each one of them. When somebody comes into my clinic, I find that I've probably seen it before with one of my kids. And also having my own kids has given me lots of opportunities to test out things that I think will be great for the kids I work with. My kids know if they're driving in the car with me and I'm making weird sounds, they say, "Mommy, are you practicing your speech sounds again?" And often I'm tweaking something, or I say, "I just bought a great game, I want to try it out and let's see how it is." So that's actually been wonderful for me. Let's start with the milestones. So at age 3, kids really understand and speak a lot. Their vocabulary is probably by the end of that 3rd year, hundreds of words. They're able to understand simple questions like what, where, and why. They can follow 2-step instructions like go get your shoes and bring them to me. They can understand and use basic spatial concepts, so referring to where things are in space, so in, on, under, and also quantity and size. So already a 3-year-old understands take only 1 cookie. They understand and they use very well, I want more, big and little. In terms of their grammar, by this age, they should be using pronouns like I, you, and me, using some plurals like cookies, not just cookie, and some past tense. So they might say, I jumped. Whereas, the year before, they might be saying, I jump, when they were talking about something that happened in the past. What does tend to happen still at this age is sometimes overgeneralization. So they may use they've learned to put ed to be past tense, and that doesn't always fit for their regular verbs, and that's still normal at this age. In terms of sentence length, their sentences are at least 3 words long, sometimes longer, and their attention span is getting longer. But when I say longer, I mean like a whole maybe 5 minutes that you could read with them or sit with them and they can stay focused to play a game on the floor. Their play skills, their pretend play is getting more sophisticated. So it's at this age that you start seeing them do longer sequences of play, but usually revolving around one thing. So for example, they might be doing pretend cooking. So they may take out the pretend food and the pretend dishes, and then they might cut up the pretend food and put it in the pot, and then take it over to the toy kitchen and put it on the stove and turn it on and mix it, and then they'll take it from there and they'll put it on a plate and they'll bring it, and they've told you that they've made you a very delicious dinner and wonderful, and they've got all those steps in revolving around cooking. They figure it out. Okay, yeah, it's not just take the food and put it on the plate. There's things you need to do with it. In terms of the sounds that they're using, they should be able to use all of the following sounds, but not necessarily in all positions in the word. So sometimes kids have some of these sounds at the beginning of the word, sometimes they have it at the end of the word. They don't necessarily have it all over, but they should have it represented somewhere in their vocabulary, and those sounds are F, G, K, T, W, Y, H, P, B, and D. And in terms of vowel sounds, pretty much almost all the vowel sounds should be in place. So they should be able to say oo, e, ah, a, eh. All those different variants of vowels, almost all of them should be in place. And one of the things we look for as speech pathologists is how much can strangers understand them? So parents, I find, often understand their kids almost no matter what, right from the beginning, even when they're a year old or 2 years old and they're really hard to understand. Parents usually get what their kids are saying almost all the time. But the big question is, what about strangers? They in the supermarket and the little old lady starts talking to them. How much do strangers understand? And we often use that as a criteria to see how are they progressing? Because parents really do understand their kids almost no matter what. So by age 3, strangers should understand your child about 3/4 of the time. So not all, but most of the time. By the time your child reaches age 4, they should know things like animal names, common objects, at least one color, although many of them know all the colors, and use sentences at least 4 words long, though usually it's more like 5 or 6 words at a time. Kids at this age are able to talk about activities that have happened before, and they can understand things like similarities and differences. So again, we're getting into a higher level of understanding of language, and then again, once you understand it, then being able to use it. At this point, they should be able to follow 3-step directions. So 3 steps might be something like, go upstairs, wash your hands, and bring your shoes. So again, more to remember in their heads and more to process as well. At this stage, the pretend play increases again. It gets more complex. So it's now at age 4, they're able to do things like act out characters from a book or from a TV show. And there's like little plots going on there. It's not just one activity and all the things that are involved with one. It's, several things going on. The superhero flies out the window, then he flies back in, then he rescues somebody under the car. So again, it's just getting more complex. It's also at age 4 is when we start seeing those early reading, those early literacy skills. So kids at this age should be able to generate simple rhymes. So if you say, hey, cat, bat, that rhymes, they should also be able to say, yeah, and Matt, and Pat. And it's also at this age where they're starting to associate some letter sounds with the letters of the alphabet. So they may not know, they may be able to recite off, ABCs, but they might not know that all of these letters actually have different sounds that correspond. I often joke that English really makes no sense. Take a letter like W. W sounds nothing like its name. W should sound like a D, but it doesn't. It sounds like a W. So it's not a phonetic language, so it's sometimes a little harder to master than some of the other phonetic languages. But again, kids at this age are starting to be able to work on that and understand those. In terms of sound production, so their articulation, they continue to progress, but there's not too many major changes between ages 3 and 4. There's another big jump when we come to age 5. So once we reach age 5, the kids at this point are kind of like people. You can have conversations with them. They have learned some sort of social skills. They can interact with other kids, mostly without intervention, not if they get in a fight. But you can say, go play this game, or go play outside, or go kick a ball together, and they can do that really without their parents needing to intervene for the most part. They're able to understand more complex instructions. So at this age, often they're in JK or in SK, and they're able to understand something like, everybody wearing blue, go stand in line. Or, if you're 5 years old, go to the block table. So again, that more complex, if this happens, then that is a higher level language skill. And really at this age, they're already able to understand that. So that's when they are able to understand those threats, like, if you don't go to bed, you won't get any candy. And again, it's that higher level language that starts happening around age 5. Kids this age also have a lot more detail, so they can describe things. They can define words. What's a chair? Oh, it's something that you sit on. By this age, they should certainly be understandable to everybody, including strangers. That's not to say they don't have any sound errors. They still may have some sound errors, but they shouldn't be so challenging that people can't really understand them. They should know all the letters of the alphabet by now, and they can start understanding the concept of syllables and starting to pick out, let's say, the first sound in a word. So knowing that lion starts with L, or ball starts with B, or their name, what their name starts with, and understanding, oh, okay, that really a word is made up of different parts. It's made up of different letters. The letters say different things. They should know opposites. They're starting now with number concepts, so knowing how to count things, understanding that if there's 2 candies, one is for them and one is for their friend. They're also able to understand time concepts. So yesterday, today, tomorrow. So tomorrow we're going to go on a trip. Yesterday I went on a play date. And even within a day, understanding morning, afternoon, night, before, after. All of those concepts, again, are higher level language concepts, which by age 5, they pretty much master. In terms of their sounds, now they've made a jump, and the sounds that they should have learned, and again, not necessarily in all places in the word, so you might not hear it all the time, but usually somewhere in their speech you should hear sounds like sh, ch, j, l, s, z, ng, like in sing, and y. And they're starting now to work on blends, and blends are 2 consonants together, like for example, BL. If you want to say blue, you have to put those 2 consonants together, and that's a step up from what they might have been doing before. They might have been saying boo instead of blue, but again, as they learn more sounds, they can start combining them. So those are the major milestones for ages 3, 4, and 5. And so now you know basically what your kids this age should be doing. So when should you be concerned? You've heard them, and maybe you're thinking, oh wait, but my kid doesn't really know the letters of the alphabet, or she can't really tell me what happened yesterday. So here's what I always tell parents. There's a few points to keep in mind. The first thing I tell them is trust your instincts. Mothers are really great at knowing their kids. You know, at this point, they've had them around for a few years, and they're really pretty good judges of what feels right, what seems right. Often I find, mom says, well, I was worried about it last year, but the doctor told me don't worry about it. Or my mother told me, when your uncle was 4 years old, he still wasn't talking, and now he's fine. And it's true, many kids do outgrow talking late. I would probably say 50 to 75% of them do, which leaves between 25 to 50% of them that don't and need intervention. So the only question is, are we going to intervene when they're younger and the gap is narrower, or are we going to wait and see? Maybe they'll outgrow it, or maybe they won't, and now we have a bigger gap to work on. And that's always the question. Research is being done and continues to be done to try and figure out, well, which kids, what are the cues to let us know that these kids are going to outgrow it and these kids are not, and they're continuing to work on that. They don't really have definitive answers. But again, I really tell parents, you know what? You know your kid best. I also tell parents, if you see your child with a group of kids their age, and everybody else in the group is doing something except for your kid, that might be a cause for concern. We always say, don't compare them to other kids, don't compare them to their siblings. But really, we do rely on looking at other kids the same age to say, this is normal. Kids this age do this, or know this, or say this. Again, it doesn't mean if there's a long list of things and your child doesn't have one thing that you need to panic, certainly not. What that usually means is if your child is not meeting those milestones, and again, we're not talking about this is a 4-year-old milestone and today's their 4th birthday and they cannot do all those things, but usually within a few months, or you can say, if a child is 4 years old and hasn't met the 3-year-old milestones, that's definitely something to look into. If your child is difficult to understand by the time they reach, age 4 to 5, and when I say difficult to understand, I'm talking about kids that strangers really don't understand most of the time. Every once in a while, there's always a word that we don't get, and strangers will understand less than that. But for the most part, they should be intelligible. They should be understandable to their peers. They should be understandable to their teachers, and even people that they just meet at the park. So that's something, again, to keep in mind. And the last thing is, if at any point they seem to be lacking appropriate social skills for their age. So again, we don't expect a 2-year-old to be able to play independently with another kid, but we do expect a 5-year-old to. And if a 5-year-old makes no eye contact, has no interest in interacting with other people, doesn't respond to things, doesn't have those more advanced and more complex play skills, that's also something that you should be concerned about. I want to add in one more point, about stuttering, which I mentioned briefly at the beginning. There is something called normal or developmental stuttering that happens between the ages of 1.5 and 6, or between ages 2 and 5. And that's the period of humongous language growth. That's when all this stuff is happening. If you look at the milestones for a child who's 12 months old, and we expect them to have, between 1 and 5 words, and by the time they reach age 2, we expect them to have between 50 and 200 words, and going into 350, 400, 500, 600 words by the time they reach age 3. We're talking about a tremendous period of growth. And sometimes what happens is, the way we describe it is there's so much going on in the brain, but somewhere along the way that it hits a short circuit, and as it tries to get out the mouth, as the kids try to express something, something happens, and it just is not coordinated enough to get that out. And it is normal for this to happen sometimes. So when I say sometimes, I mean probably less than 10% of the time. It's something that may go on for a few weeks, maybe even in a month, but not something that goes on for a year. And if there's any family history of stuttering, so it tends to run more among males,